I have always had a very deep respect for native spirituality, and in all of my learning about different traditions and important figures, I never thought I could ever come into contact with a piece of it. I didn't even think that it was a possibility that these animals were shapeshifters of any sort, until very recently I was telling my brother about it, and he told me that it might be. I grew up in the central mountains of Idaho, in between several big mining towns from the late 1800s, and living here for most of my life. I know what the wildlife looks like, and I know what I would see in which time of year, except for a few encounters that I still can't complain. I was out early with my dad and my grandfather to go and find a scrap pile to get some firewood from. It was about 7 or 8 in the morning, and we're on a tiny dirt path, miles away from any house. As we're driving, we turn a corner to see an animal sitting in the middle of the road. I would say that it was the size of about a large dog, but hunched close to the ground, completely black. It had a long tail that dragged on the ground. Then we pulled up, and it turned to look at us and had a small head, with either small ears or no ears. I couldn't see anything specific. After it saw us, it hopped off the trail into the bushes on the side of the road. Believe me when I tell you this, I have never in my life seen an animal that looked like this. We were all confused. One other time, I was out riding my ATV at around sunset. I was by myself on some trails that I knew well. I decided to start exploring a bit and took a different path. Suddenly, it started to go up a steep hill with lots of washout. As I stopped to try and turn around, the scariest looking bird I have ever seen ran in front of me across the trail. There are a lot of wild chickens, turkeys, etc., but this was about the size of a chicken, but it almost appeared as if the body was backwards, or if it was standing straight up, looking very skinny, just not like a bird. I could not see any visible wings, but it did have a longer neck, and its head was bare, like a turkey, or a vulture's might be. I finished turning around and sped back home. I don't know much of the native tribes that would have inhabited this area long before the gold rush, but I do know that a lot of violence and death happened because of it, with the historical cemetery having well over 100 unmarked graves. If anyone might be able to confirm or deny my theory, I would really appreciate that. So this day started out with a phone call from my brother, who was asking to take a hike in the national forest outside of our town, and then to go spend the night out there, in hopes of doing a little fishing and roasting some marshmallows over a fire. It was me, my brother, his girlfriend, who I see as my loving little sister, so it was going to be a really nice night. We left town, headed to the woods pretty early that day, around 3 in the afternoon. We had gotten to our spot in the woods after 2 hours of riding around, trying to find the perfect spot to set up our tent. My brother, sister, and I decided to start the day with some fishing. We grabbed our rods and tackle box, headed for a little stream about a quarter mile from our spot. As we came close to the stream, we noticed this awful smell, kind of like rotting meat. When we came up to the river, we found the source of the smell, an abundance of dead fish, all around the edge of the stream, and had seen the water that had a nasty rust-colored tint to it. When we were done gagging at the sight and smell of what was in front of us, a huge sense of dread washed over with an uncomfortable feeling of being watched. My sister noticed, asked what was wrong. I played it off with a joke, suggesting we go make a fire and setting up tent. I shrugged it off, really not wanting to frighten her or anybody else. After another 30-minute hike, from the stream back to the campground, my brother and sister began collecting wood for the fire, while I began to set up the tent. I set the tent up around the same time they came back with enough wood to have a fire last quite a long while. We got the fire lit. I admit, it was a pretty darn good fire. We then decided to roast marshmallows. Before I could eat any, I had to take a leak. So I told them I was going to step into the woods for just a second to go pee. I walk about 30 feet in and began to relieve myself when I heard my sister say hello. Finding this extremely odd, I looked around and didn't see anything or anyone. So, naturally, I go back to do my business. As I was zipping up my zipper, I heard her say it again. Hey. Thinking they were pranking me, I rushed back to the campground to find them still roasting marshmallows over the fire. I kind of freaked out. I'd asked them if they were messing with me, to which they frowned, explained that they've been in the same spot since I went to the woods. Now I'm terrified. They saw how ghost-white I was, and asked me if everything was all right. I told them what I'd heard. They suggested we just go into the tent and go to bed early, so that's what we did. After already taking a while to fall asleep, I woke up in the middle of the night to some underbrush crunching just right outside our tent, and that horrible smell from earlier was back, worse than before. For fear of scaring the hell out of my brother and sister, I decided to not wake them up. As I sat there, shaking and sweating, I noticed the sound of twigs snapping, and it had stopped. I began to hear what I could swear was loud, raspy, heavy breathing, like something was trying to sniff out our tent. I quietly tried to lay back down, cover my ears so I couldn't hear the breathing anymore, and eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning we woke up late, so we decided to start packing up our belongings and head home. When we got out of the tent, the first thing we noticed was our cooler was torn up and down, thrown upside down against a tree, with everything in it was strewn throughout the campsite. Another thing I noticed was when I was rolling the tent up, a ton of footprints, weird footprints, that looked almost like normal, except for obvious claw marks above each toe. Once I spotted these, I hurried up, putting the tent in my truck, and got my brother, sister, and myself out of there as quick and safely as I could. As of yet, I haven't been back camping in any kind of woods, and I can't imagine coming across another one of these things. The following experience happened just a few years ago. The person I was dating at the time was Native, and invited me to go with them to their grandmother's house for Christmas. This being the first time I've ever been to a Native American reservation, I wasn't sure what to expect. I had a lot of ideas regarding what might be, as well as the what-ifs. Nevertheless, excited to go somewhere I had never been before. Most of my excitement was reserved towards learning more about the culture and the unique opportunity of visiting a reservation as an outsider. Because of this, I was also a bit nervous. What if I wasn't accepted? Would the people be welcoming, or would they be hostile towards my presence? Although these questions were lingering, most of my fears were quelled by the wonderful hospitality that I had been shown by both Grandma and the people I had the privilege to interact with, all while visiting. We left our house on Christmas Eve with our dog and began to make the journey, a 4-hour journey to Grandma's house. On the way, we saw a beautiful sunset scatter across the mountains. After traveling for about 3 hours, we find ourselves at the turnoff that leads to an hour-long drive on a desolate road that would eventually take us to our destination. While on this road, my significant other shared stories of dances and the polytheistic practices their tribe had. All of it fascinated me and left me asking more and more questions than I had ever imagined asking. And by the time we arrive at Grandma's house, it's dark and cold. As I begin to unpack the car, my significant other takes our dog a bit away from the house to go potty. By the time they get back, I have taken our bags inside, locked the car up for the night. We sit around the kitchen table, eating food, amazing food cooked by Grandma. We share stories and play a card game. After about an hour, we all say goodnight and get ready to turn in for bed. It's now 12 a.m. My significant other and I lay down, and I call our dog to the bed. A short time thereafter, we fall asleep, although I had forgotten to turn off the light next to the bed on the nightstand. Around 2, maybe 3 a.m., I woke up, having to use the restroom, and noticed that our dog was sitting, just looking at the door that led out to the small hallway. On the other side was the main door to the house. I called for her to come back to the bed. She was just putting her nose at the base of the bedroom, sniffing while scratching. Thinking that she too had to use the restroom, I walked up to the main house door, opened it, ushering her to go potty. She ended up just sitting there and staring. After trying to get her to go outside a few times, failing in my attempts, I closed the door, made my way to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. In the kitchen, there's a big window to the very right of the sink. That window overlooks the driveway to the house with a bit of light. It makes the driveway just barely visible at nighttime. As I reach to turn on the faucet, my head turns to the right to look outside. I see a dog sitting outside, staring into the house. Something was off about this dog. It was much larger than a typical large breed by 2 times. I began to get the chills, and internally said to myself, "Screw this." Grabbing my water, about to head back to bed, the dog gets up and begins to walk away. One thing that I might feel not to convey well is the way this dog walked. It seemed to walk very awkwardly and almost stiff. After making my way back to bed, falling asleep and waking up the next morning, while eating the breakfast that Grandma had made, I just nonchalantly asked to anyone listening at the table if the neighbors had an extra large dog. That's when Grandma began to ask questions, and my significant other began to look very concerned. Grandma immediately made a few phone calls, and after a bit of time had passed, a native priest and healer arrived at the house. They began to converse silently with Grandma. Thinking I must have done something wrong, my significant other joins my grandma in conversation. They all begin to look at me, talk more, and then the priest goes around the house with sage and cedar. The healer comes to talk with me and Grandma about my experience. My significant other disappears outside the house to gather raw meat. From what I can gather, I encountered something I should not have the previous night, and by my arrival, or an outsider, they had to make certain preparations to ensure our safety for the duration of my stay. After this visit, we visited many other times. I had no other weird experiences, but this particular experience left me chilled to the bone, and I'll live with it the rest of my life. I just can't get over how this dog behaved and how large it was. It all was just so strange.